Time for another episode of Laser Radio. I'm Brad Sohner. Today we've got another installment on the Laser Legends series, talking to John Howard, three-time Summer Olympian who represented the United States on the bike in the 68, 72, and 76 games. He was also the first winner of the Red Zinger Classic, the race that went on to become the Coors Classic. One of the first four competitors in 1982 in the inaugural race across America. And he was also the world land speed record holder on the bicycle, going 152 miles an hour out of the Bonneville Salt Flats. We talk about that. Great episode with John today, brought to you by the new Laser Bullet helmet. The perfect combination of aerodynamics and ventilation. The Bullet is designed with a narrow front profile and smooth top section with minimal venting for maximum aerodynamic benefit. The air slide system allows for ventilation on demand with a quick and easy adjustment of the front vent cap. Compatible with both the Laser Life Beam integrated heart rate monitor system and the laser inclination sensor position monitor, the Bullet is available in both standard and MIPS versions. In stock and available now, visit your local laser dealer for more information on the Laser Bullet. John, first off, thanks for joining us on the show today. We have a lot to get to because you have had a diverse career on the bike. I want to start with a race that kind of sparked this whole series of podcasts talking about the Legends of American Cycling series here on Laser Radio. The Red Zinger Coors Classic, you were the winner of the first two editions of that race. If you would, just kind of give me an idea of what bike racing in America was like at that time and how important the Red Zinger was.
Well, the Zinger, let's see, I'm trying to remember who, I think it was Mo Siegel at the time was running the Celestial Tea Company, and he had a grand vision, I believe, about 1973, 74. I won it in 75 and 76. But Mo decided it was time for some corporation to take the lead and sponsor cyclists. At that point, there was very little sponsorship in cycling. Raleigh, which this was an East Coast company at the time in Massachusetts, decided that sponsorship was a good idea, but it was not a huge program. They picked some elite cyclists, mostly from the East Coast, and sponsored them, myself included. That was 74, I believe, and 75 they kicked the program into full gear, and we did some traveling. We rode a stage race down in Baja, California, but in the late winter, early spring. And my Raleigh teammate, John Alice, helped me win that race. It was a 7-day ride from Mexicali, or I guess it was clear down on the Baja Peninsula, La Paz, all the way up the peninsula, Mexicali, Tijuana. So that was a huge race. It was an international event that drew teams from all over, and with John's help, I was able to win that, and that set up the Coors Class. Or sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The Red Zinger Classic in 75, and we had a strong team for that race, and we prevailed. I won, and I think Alice was in the top 5. And at that time, cycling was still struggling, but there were some good riders who were independently sponsored. But Raleigh held all the cards, so we were the top team, and we did, I won't say dominate the race, but we did win it. And 76 was a bigger spectacle because it was the Olympic year, and I was very frustrated because I really wanted a gold medal in the road race in Montreal. Unfortunately, had a crash early in the race, chased for most of the event, caught the field, but by that time the break was with George Mount had already gone, so I missed my chance. But after that, I got my revenge. Many of the riders came down from the Montreal Olympics to the the Zinger in '76, and again I won it based on my time trial, mostly time trial. I had decent performances in the road race, but the time trial was my specialty event, and I won that, and that was enough to guarantee me the overall win. It wasn't a huge stage race at that time. A 3-4 day race was a big event, but that gives you a little bit of a flavor for the era.
The 76 games were your third Summer Olympics. You competed in the 68 games, the 72 games, and then the 76 games. So you were obviously racing at a high level long before these the Red Zinger days. Tell me a little bit about getting into cycling. 1968. I got to imagine the selection process for the Olympic team is a lot different than it is today.
I haven't kept up. I don't know. I couldn't answer that one, but I do know that the process was fairly straightforward. If you felt that you got to keep in mind that there were very few racing cyclists in the country at the time. I would bet that in 1966, 67, there were probably less than 7,000 registered members with the, let's see, what would it have been called at the time? The ABLA, Amateur Bicycle League of America, which became eventually USA Cycling. And at that point, all you had to do was show up. In this case, it was the Agora Mountains out in just north of LA. Rattlesnake infested wild country at the time. It's no longer that way, but I just remember the road race being hard, but I was ready. I had been training in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and had plenty of climbing prowess at the time. I was riding well, a little bit lighter than I am now, and climbing was something I really enjoyed doing. So I made the team on the second day of the trials, and like I said, anybody who felt that they were good enough could show up and compete in the trials. There was no category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was just, if you wanted to race bicycles, you came out and you did it. It was all mass start, huge field. The top riders of the era, Bob Parsons, Mike Pickens, Danny Butler, were all well known. I was the wild card, I guess you could say. Bob Hansing, who was the coach, had pre-picked the team. He got every single person that was on the team, including the track riders. I was the one exception because nobody had ever heard of me before. I had not done a lot of racing, but had won several events back in the Midwest in Indiana and Missouri. So I knew I could compete against the best, and I did. I beat Bob Parsons in the road race for the national road title that year, and put myself on the team. And in spite of that, I still was not considered a time trialist, and I know the coaches debated long and hard as to whether to put me in the 100-kilometer team time trial, but eventually they did, and I feel like I was pretty much the spark plug of that team. I don't know if you know a lot about the history of what happened in Mexico in '68. I don't want to go into it, but there was a lot of politics and a lot of disaster that occurred there that was much greater than what happened in Munich 4 years later. But the politics did get in the way to some extent, but we raced well, and I think we were top 15 in the 100K team time trial in spite of having only 3 riders. So we lost one of our riders in the first 10 kilometers. So it was a hard effort for 3 riders in a 4-man event. But we put ourselves on the map, and I think gained the respect of some of the cycling luminaries. at the time.
Sure.
So all went well, and that set us up for a little more international attention. And it was easier for me to train in an environment where I had other riders to train with. Back in Missouri, there just were no cyclists, and I had to drive 200-300 miles to find other riders to train with. So I was basically riding the Ozark Mountains on my own, trying to get in shape for the Pan American Games in '71, and that was a big event for cycling, because it was, as I recall, the road race was one of the last events, and I won the road race with the help of my teammates, mostly Mike Neal, who set up a wonderful block late in the race. He and Agustina Alcantara from Mexico got away early, and it was a 200-kilometer race, and Neal did a superb job of holding off the field with Alcantara, and then with the 100K to go, I broke away with Brazilian. I am trying to remember his name at this point. It's a lot of time has gone by. Carlos Flores from Brazil, and we stayed away, barely stayed away for the next 100 kilometers, and it was a street circuit race in the final 100K. The first 100K were out in the Andes, and then second 100 were through the streets of Cali. And I broke a spoke late in the race, and I almost went down in the water that crossed the track, and just barely squeezed out the wind from Flores in the sprint, and the pack just engulfed us at the line. It was one of those fairy tale endings that was significant historically in cycling, because it brought money into the sport. Now, prior to that, if you didn't have money, or you didn't have some form of sponsorship, there was very little that you could do. And this actually, there were two events, I think, that brought money into cycling. One was my win in Cali in the road race, and the other was Jack Syme's silver medal in the kilometer at the World Championships in Uruguay. And I think that was a year later, either a year earlier or a year later, I don't recall. But those two events, according to Al Tofield, who was the head of the U.S. Cycling, USCF, whatever you want to call it. The organization has changed several times, but according to Al, those two events brought money into cycling. So not only was there a trickle of sponsorship funding, we finally got money from the USOC. So the United States Olympic Committee finally started kicking funds into the sport of cycling, which of course really brought out far more talent. And I think that was, I always look at the historical events that helped bring cycling into the forefront as an American sport. And and it's never, you think it's never been an American sport, and we think of it more as a European sport, but in fact, at the turn of the century, you went to baseball games when all the seats at the bike track were sold out. So cycling was immensely popular at the turn of the century, and so much so that a lot of the big brands, like Ivor Johnson, which was a popular cycling company, and they built a number of different types of bicycles in that era, were all imported to Europe. And the Europeans revered American quality manufacturing, and so the sport really had a presence in the United States back at that late 1890s, early 1900s. And I think that's an era that has been largely forgotten.
How close do you think we got to getting back to that era during the boom of the Red Zinger Course Classic days? Because I think it could be argued that there was certainly a bump in popularity of bike racing at that time. Greg LeMond was a big part of that. But, I mean, how close did you feel like we were getting back to bike racing being a big-time sport in the United States?
Well, I view it more as a subculture sport. Subculture notoriety will take you a long way in terms of cult appeal, but it didn't have the mainstream. You didn't read about cycling in the sports pages. You read about it in other parts of the newspaper, which, it just didn't get the national attention that it does to some degree today. You certainly didn't watch it on TV. There was no television whatsoever, no coverage of cycling in terms of TV. So that was huge in terms of launching sports, and we didn't have that. However, we did have a growing base of popularity, and far more cyclists were emerging in places like California, of course, and Colorado, and back east. So you're seeing an influx of athletic talent into the sport, and that was very encouraging. But mainstream, no, we didn't. We still don't have that. But I think cycling will always have a strong presence. We just need some events to kick it off, and I think that's coming. I really believe that, because arguably it is the number one participant sport worldwide. And if you think about all the people that ride bicycles, even in gyms, that counts. So,
sure.
So in terms of an activity, you could say it's probably the number one participation sport worldwide. And I think that certainly has improved the quality of competition on the grassroots level.
You've worked with a lot of riders, not as not as an athlete, but as a coach, mentor, director. Talk about that kind of shift. I know one famous guy, I'll call him famous on the podcast. He was our first guest on this podcast, actually, is Brad Huff.
Oh yes, I have a huge respect for Brad. He's just he does it all. He doesn't have a huge motor, but boy, does he have the will. And to me, I would almost rather have that spirit than raw talent. But Brad is an explosive sprinter, and he can pull off some amazing races when he's on and is having a good day. So yeah, I worked with Brad when he was a teenager back in Missouri, and then again out here in California. He came to one of our training camps in the San Diego area, and paid full ticket for it too. And we weren't offering any special deals to anybody, but I got to know Brad pretty well then, and we've stayed friends ever since. And I just wish him the best. But I think that in terms of ability, he could go far in terms of track racing. I don't think he ever did enough track racing. I think he had real ability there, but of course track racing doesn't have the broad appeal that criteriums and road races have, stage races here.
How did that relationship start? I mean, did you find him? Did you see him at a race and say, this kid's got potential? Did he come to you? How did you guys meet?
I think he pretty much came to me. I don't recall how, at this point, how we connected, but I knew of him in the Springfield Bear Grove area, which is a place I used to train a lot back in Missouri when I lived in the Ozarks. But yeah, I don't recall exactly how we we connected, but I'm sure glad we did.
Yeah, good thing you did. I think Brad would say the same thing.
Yeah.
So, moving away from competitive cycling, you've had endurance sports in your blood for a long time. Just looking at your achievements down the list, it's pretty clear you had a diverse interest of endurance sports. So that brings me to Ironman. 1981, you go to the Ironman World Championships in Hawaii and win. Tell me about that shift from competitive road cyclist to deciding you're going to go to Ironman Hawaii.
Well, like a lot of people, I read the article in Sports Illustrated. It was a feature, and I was intrigued by the idea. I had swam in college, and I did some running in high school. I don't think I was a great runner, but I could do a decent 440 mile, and it's way off the pace from Jim Ryan and the 350s, but I could still do longer distance pretty well. Unfortunately we didn't have long events in high school back in that era, but I think, and in retrospect, that my running was really the catalyst that got me into triathlon, and it was fun back then. The pressure wasn't on. It was just you're experiencing something new, a change of pace. I was kind of blown out on cycling at the time, and in 1979 I went to, was it 80? I guess 80. I went to the Ironman. At that time they didn't even call it the World Championships. It hadn't reached that status level yet, and I got third behind Dave Scott, and I almost caught Dave on the bike. I got tangled in the coral on the swim course and lost a huge amount of time, and was one of the last out of the water, and then made up almost all of it on the bike. And I think my course record still stands, and I was on a 23-pound Chinelli road bike at the time, no aero, anything. And then the next year, I put it all together and really focused on the swim and the run. And with some significant injury, plantar fascia injury, I had a lot of cortisone shot into my foot, and I was barely able to run, and got through the marathon. And let's see, I think I beat Tom Warren and Scott Tinley. And won what was the first event on the Big Island, and that was the World Championship. So I was thrilled with that one, and I don't think I ever really had another race quite that strong. It was a real high point in my triathlon career. I raced for 9 years doing tries. And enjoyed it. It was always fun to me. And at the point, I think I can recall training one day, it just occurred to me in a sort of Forrest Gump moment. I'm done. I've had it. This is all I want to do. I don't need to run and swim anymore. And so I slowed it all down a notch and became not competitive, but just did it recreationally. And that's kind of been the way things have been ever since. I believe that athletic balance is important, and swimming, biking, and running together all made sense to me, but not as a competitive sport.
Okay. I want to talk about a different kind of competitive sport on the bike. We talked about road racing, but you were also one of the first competitors in the inaugural Race Across America. What drives a man to race 3 other people across the country?
Well, John Moreno, Mike Shermer, and I were at an event in, I believe it was Columbus, Ohio. It was a cycling event in the dead of winter, and we kicked around this idea of doing a race from coast to coast. And John had already done that. He'd already made several runs and had set some records. And the only person we didn't know, who was the dominant long distance cyclist at the time, Lon Haldeman. He was not at that event, but of course we knew we had to invite him because he had just done a back-to-back crossing. And I frankly did not take these guys seriously. I didn't realize how hard they had all trained for this event. And, I trained hard at the very end of it, which probably was to my demise. I didn't do it right. So we went out and we got, I'm trying to remember, Jerry Kushnick, who was Jay Leno's agent in Hollywood, to promote this event. And he brought Budweiser into the mix. And so we had some sponsorship money to pull it off. The problem was it took much longer than we had originally planned. We wanted to do it in the spring, but it ended up being mid-August when we actually made the event happen. And it was brutally hot, a hard event, probably the most difficult cycling event I've ever competed in. And it went okay, but I got heat exhaustion at some point, I think out near Redlands, and dropped to last place. And there were only 4 of us, Haldeman, Shermer, Marino, and I, and they were all way ahead of me. And I was just, should I go on? And I've got to do this. We were all committed to this event. So I pulled myself up and caught everybody but Lon, and so I finished second overall, 10 days, 10 hours, I think. Headwinds all the way from Kansas. It was a very hard year, as I recall, but epic in the sense that we started on the Santa Monica Pier in L.A. and finished at the Empire State Building in New York City. So it was maybe a little longer than the current RAAM route, but challenging in many ways, but partly because of the weather, partly because of the course. But I said on camera on the ABC Wide World of Sports, which by the way won an award for their presentation on the event, I said, I will never do this again, and I never did. So that was it for me. I felt like I can do 24 hours. That's my limit. And I think I can do that better than anybody in the world. And I did. I set a world record of 539 miles eventually, several years after that RAAM. And that was about the longest ride I've ever done.
Tell me about that attempt. Where did you do it? What were you riding? How did you do it?
Bill Humphreys, my old Raleigh teammate, was one of the promoters of that. It was in Clearwater, Florida, and I think the year was 1987, so several years after RAAM. And that was kind of my last hurrah at ultra distance cycling. I was burned out on that as well. So Clearwater was a quarter-mile asphalt car racing track, stock car track, and I just remember getting dizzy in the first hour and thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a long day. And it
23 to
was
go.
a long day. Yeah, I think I averaged 22.9 miles an hour for the full 24 hours. So that was it on ultra distance racing. I mean, you think, look back at it and like, this is going to be fun, and it is fun for a while, but I think there's a point of diminished returns where you have to move on, and this is not something I want to make a career out of. So one RAAM, that was actually the third attempt at the world record of 24 hours, and the first 2 were done in Central Park in New York City during an event called the Pepsi Marathon, which was a 24-hour endurance race. And I knew there's no way you're going to be able to ride fast on a course like the Central Park Loop. It's just too hilly. So Bill wanted to do Clearwater because he lived in Tampa at the time. So this was perfect. It was the perfect venue to really kind of put it all out there and say, I can do this. I did it. I'm done.
A good note to go out on.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the ultra endurance bug, but you also had an ultra speed record when you set the land speed record on a bike at, was it 152 miles an hour?
Yes, I wanted to break Dr. Alan Abbott's 140 mile per hour record, which was done on the Bonneville Salt Flats. And I'd had that dream since I was 12 years old. And I walked into a Schwinn bike store in Springfield, Missouri, A&B Cycle. I can still remember that day. I was 12 years old, and there was a comic book on the counter, which was a commemorative piece that they had done on Alf Latournier, who was probably the greatest six-day racer who ever lived from France. And Latournier was sponsored by Schwinn, and they built him a special Schwinn Paramount with a very, very large chainring on it. And this was in 1941, he went out, and it took him several attempts too. And it was a section of unopened freeway near Bakersfield, California, and he went 100, and I believe it was 108 miles an hour. I've got that comic book still, in my museum. But he went 108 miles an hour. So I saw that and I said, that's what I want to do. And that's what brought me into cycling. That was the event.
Wow. So this was on your radar for a long time.
Yeah. It took a long time to get the resources together. And we were able to convince Pepsi-Cola and Wendy's to come on board as our sponsors. And I met Gary Hooker and Dave Spangler, his partner of Hooker Headers, at the Ironman in the year I won in '81. And it helps to have just won the big one. And so I sat down with Dave and Gary, and I explained to them what I wanted to do, and they said, we can help you. We've got access to the Vesco Streamliner, which was a 300 mile an hour race car. And we built that, they built the fairing that essentially bored a hole through the wind and allowed me to, it took 3 years to break that record. We had horrible conditions at Bonneville, two years in a row, and eventually went to Baja, Mexico, and I think the fastest we got down there was 128, which was absolutely terrifying because of the road conditions. And so we waited patiently for another year and finally got decent weather at Bonneville on a short course, 5 miles. We went 152.2 miles an hour. So I got records at both ends of the spectrum of madness, if you will, the endurance record and the speed record. That was one of the things that I wanted to do outside of the normal role of bicycle racing, is to set both an endurance record and a speed record. So I got that, and so looking back at it, it was a lot of fun. And I'm currently coaching Denise Mueller, who is I think will eventually break the men's record. This woman is probably the most talented cyclist I've ever worked with. Unfortunately, she decided that after winning 13 national titles to become a mother and dropped out of cycling. Is still a junior, I believe, and then came back after the kids were out of the nest, and I helped her win 2 more Masters National Crit Championships, which are tough to do.
Yeah.
And she got 2 back-to-back National Criterium Championships, and then we started focusing on the speed record, which just totally intrigued her, and still does. And we're setting it up for September of this year. Hopefully, we will have the sponsorship in place and a car that will do the job. we used the Range Rover SVR in 2016, and she got the women's world record, 147 miles an hour. But amazing athlete. I've seen her deadlift 230 pounds. She's a powerhouse of a cyclist, and was a great sprinter. And my only regret with Denise is she never got a shot at the pro ranks, because I think she would have been an amazing professional sprinter. But it just wasn't in the cards. But I believe we're going to.
Life happens.
Exactly, and we want to see her break a professional men's record, because this woman is capable of it. She's got the power to do it, and I think that playing the empowerment card to the extent of actually going out and doing it, I believe I'm cracking the whip, and I believe we'll get her there. So that's my prediction for 2018 September at the Bonneville Salt Flats.
Wow, cool. Explain how you do a land speed record. I mean, how do you get up to speed? Are you communicating with the car? How does a land speed record attempt go?
The Reader's Digest version of that is that you sit in the protected void of the car. The car is boring a hole through the wind, as I mentioned earlier, and you want to be in communication with the driver. Communication systems are very, very difficult. Due to the noise of the engine noise and the conditions. You'd think it could be done, but it's a lot more difficult than you think. So what we did with our driver, Shay Holbrook, I wanted an all-women's team out at Bonneville. What we did, we invented a method of sign language using the turn indicators and the hazard lights and from the vehicle, and we had enough of a communication in the beginning, and in terms of rehearsal, that we were able to pull it off. But communication's very, very hard. So what we did was we got her up to speed. Unfortunately, there was a lot of crosswind. And if you watch the video carefully, you can see the car is actually drifting at close to 160 miles an hour. So it's scary. There's just no two ways about it. I've been asked to describe the sensation, and it's exhilarating, but it's also terrifying at the same time. And you have to be a good bike handler. And I was a decent bike handler. Denise is a great bike handler, and she is able to make course corrections instantaneously, and that's what it takes. You have to track that car, which is not always going in an absolutely straight line.
Yeah, how close to the car are you? I mean, are you
inches.
Sitting on the bumper like motor pacing a
You have to sit inside the protected void of the car. The fairing essentially keeps you safe from crosswinds, and your job is to use that vortex as your protected zone, and the closer you get, the better off you are. And there's a push-pull factor in the I think it's there's a term for this. I can't remember the term, but there's a von Karman effect, which is the push-pull concept that is very, very easy to follow. You simply drift in, you drift out, back and forth, and if you go too far out of the protected zone, you're going to get slammed by the wind. So you have to stay in that zone. And I think I worked a little harder than she did, because I didn't have that protected area. I was sitting behind the car where she was actually sitting in it. Right. And the current men's world record holder, Fred Rumpelberg from the Netherlands, also had a car that allowed him to get actually inside the vortex or in the fairing, which creates the vortex. So there's so many mechanical and physical nuances to that event. It becomes a science in and of itself. which I'm sure is pretty much the same thing you have in any sport. Watching the Olympics on TV, you see all of these athletes in the Winter Olympics, and they try to describe all of these very, very subtle things that none of us who are not snowbound can figure out. But I sense in hearing that it's very similar to what we went through with the land speed record at Bonneville.
What kind of bike are you riding? I mean, I can't imagine you're riding a standard bike at 150 miles an hour. I got to think those would fall apart.
Yeah, it's nothing at all like a regular bike. I chose the small wheel, 18-inch motorcycle rubber and wheels for safety. We had dual suspension, front and rear, because there's so much vibration on the salt. Tires are V-rated, 150 mile an hour sustained, shaved to match the salt conditions. The bike is a very long wheelbase, low CG for stability, and if you see any of the video, I mean, I think there is certainly some video on YouTube. You'll see that she's sitting very low, but her body position is actually high, because things happen so quickly. You have to be able to respond to them, and we found that the higher body position is the better position for maintaining stability. So yeah, it's complicated. And the bike, Denise decided she didn't want any brakes on it on the new version of the bike, so we're going to take the brakes off and just let her deal with essentially a single fixed gear. It's a reduction system that has I believe that final drive ratio is 486 inches, which gives her about 130 feet per revolution of the crank.
Yeah.
So the gear is way too big to pedal out of the blocks. You have to get a tow. Tow sometimes will go up close to 100 miles an hour, and then she's on her own. So she pedals up to the final speed. But at about 90 miles an hour, she's able to turn the gear over. But it's just so huge.
Wow,
that is
massive.
Yeah, that's what it takes.
It's a fixed gear. There's no freewheel on the back.
That's right. Yeah, fixed gear.
Wow. So as she's getting up to speed from 0 to 100, you're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4 rotations per minute.
Right.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's a real slow start, but they're dragging her up to speed really quickly. The Rover had the 550 horsepower supercharged Jaguar engine in it, so that's its power source. So it had plenty of juice. And we're hoping to work with an American car company on the next round. But we do have several options on cars. So hopefully we'll get it done in 2018. That's our plan anyway.
Yeah, here's hoping. How much does the bike weigh? I would assume
it's heavy. It's about 25, 26, maybe closer to 30, all fully equipped. But weight is not such a factor. You're far more concerned about stability at that speed.
Right. That's not even as heavy as I would have thought it would be to hold up at 150 miles an hour. And it's all custom, right? The frame, I assume it starts with it's got to be a metal frame. It's not carbon.
Yeah, we built the bike around the rider.
Right.
We wanted to make sure that it was
steel,
that she was
aluminum,
comfortable
titanium?
with it. We used carbon fiber. Lynn Lockmiller was the builder, and we used the existing technology from my bike, which just sold it at Copec last year. But we had all the design diagrams on that, and we also used Fred Rumpelberg's bike as well, which was modeled off of my bike. So we took what we thought was the best combination of equipment and design. So the geometry was very similar to the machines that we had used. But
Wow,
when you
very
put
cool.
carbon down, you're certainly going to go lighter than steel. So
Yeah, but there's no concern about the carbon not holding up.
Oh, the carb. Well, we actually did have the steering dampener, which is an essential ingredient, did snap, and the actual final run we had it glued back together with a hose clamp. But things happen when equipment breaks. You have to fix it.
Yeah, and you're a long way from the nearest bike shop out of the Bonneville
About
Salt
120
Flats.
miles. Yeah.
Not as easy as just going down to the local shop and getting it fixed. Wow.
Right.
So,
Well,
go
yeah,
ahead.
Bonneville was an adventure. I don't think it was the highlight of my career, but it was fun to pursue a goal that I had since I was 12 years old, and was really the impetus to my cycling career in the first place. So,
Yeah.
I look at it now as one of those events that was important on many levels from a personal perspective.
You've got this attempt coming up in September, but anything else on your radar?
Well, yes, I have a huge project that I'm working on. Rashid Bahati and I from the Bahati Foundation are putting together a documentary film on Major Taylor, Marshall Major Taylor, the first African-American sports hero in America. And sadly, only a few people know about him, know that he ever existed. In that golden era of cycling, when you did indeed go to bicycle races, and the velodromes were plentiful and they were filled. And
yeah, when Madison Square Garden was made for
Madison. Yeah, Madison Square Gardens was an event that Major Taylor actually rode as an 18-year-old in 1894.
Wow.
And what we're trying to do is use all of the experts to tell the story and do a documentary film that I think is going to help cycling in many respects. But I think it's sad that 50 years before Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball, and 35 years before Jesse Owens had his success at the 36 Olympics, Major Taylor was a renowned superstar, especially in Europe, but endured a lot of racial animosity in the United States, and had a tough go of it. I mean, there were times when a third of the field in these track races would be riding not to win, but to make sure Taylor didn't win. You can imagine what that was like. And he had an explosive sprint. He was a sub 11 second 200 meter sprinter, and on period equipment that includes wooden wheels. So he had an ability that was for the times, it was extraordinary. I don't think there were any sprinters. He certainly beat all of the top sprinters in Europe, hands down. But as I say, it was always difficult because of the era, the Jim Crow era in American history, when there were only a handful of black athletes, period, including Jack Johnson, of course, who was eventually a world champion boxer. But Major Taylor and Johnson were friends, and they certainly compared notes on what it was like to compete at the international level, and being African Americans, what they endured in the process. And it was difficult. It was very difficult. But they both excelled, and I think what Rashid and I would like to do is tell the story. And we are also working on a feature film as well. But the documentary, in all likelihood, will be the first thing that we produce.
Well, certainly a story worth being told. It's It's an amazing tale, that's for sure. He was a big
Yes.
influence on you early on. I think I read somewhere that he was one of your cycling heroes from the get-go.
Yeah, well, I think the thought of Major Taylor was, I had met his daughter at the ceremonies for the Hall of Fame in 1989, and we were both at the time, and well, actually, they still do it this way. There are cyclists from the past as well as the present that are inducted into the Hall of Fame, and this was in Somerville, New Jersey, in '89, and I found it exciting and very moving that his daughter Sydney, who was at that time a very lucid 84-year-old, would be there to accept that honor. So I started chatting with Sydney, and later went back to Pittsburgh to interview her, and out of that came a book, which I will. The working title is Requiem for a Wheelman. It's not the happy story of Major Taylor, because he died a pauper on the streets of Chicago during the height of the Depression, and I wanted to tell the entire story. I don't think the film will do that. Certainly the documentary will, but this is life, and I think that's exactly how it should be told. So what I wanted to do at the time was just document it, because I don't think that had been done. There are several great biographies on Major Taylor. Andrew Ritchie has written a great book, Todd Balth, and of course Peter Nye, who I consider to be the foremost cycling historian, has done a great job documenting his life story. But what I wanted to do was create a more of a nonfiction novel, and that's what Requiem is all about. And there are gaps in the story which we simply don't know, and I've given myself some creative license in telling the story, but I believe it works. I believe the whole thing is poignant and true in every respect to history.
Very cool. Well, you're certainly a man who knows a good story when he sees it, whether you're telling it or making it. You've had a pretty incredible career.
Thank you, Brad.
John, we appreciate you taking the time to join us on the show today. Unfortunately, we've got to wrap it up there. I could do this for 4 hours with you if I had to. You've got some incredible stories, my friend.
Well, it's been fun. I just have scratched the surface, but I think we have to, pay homage to those who have paved the way, and in my case, it's cyclists like Major Taylor, and I would hope that some of the current generation would see that lineage as an important connection in the vital history of where we've come from.
All right, that's John Howard here on Laser Radio. John, thanks again for taking the time, and we'll talk to you again.
All right, bye-bye.
This has been another episode of Laser Radio. Be sure to check out more great cycling podcasts on the Wide Angle Podium Network. Until next time, I'm Brad Sohner, saying thanks for listening.